The letter trembled in Jane Calloway's hands, the cruel words blurring as tears filled her eyes. Insufficient funds, it read, followed by a curt explanation that Mr. Albert Cunningham no longer wished to proceed with their arrangement. The train rumbled beneath her feet as the vast Wyoming landscape stretched endlessly outside the window, a sea of golden prairie that had once held such promise. It was 1875, and Jane was exactly halfway between the life she'd fled in Boston and the future she'd been promised in Prosperity, Wyoming. Now, that future had evaporated like morning dew under the harsh western sun. Final stop, Riverbank. Riverbank Station, the conductor called, his voice cutting through Jane's misery. This wasn't supposed to be her stop. She was meant to continue westward for another day to meet her intended husband. But the telegram had found her at the last station. The man had discovered she had only $8 to her name, not the modest savings she'd claimed in her letters. Her small deception, born of desperation after her father's debts had left her destitute, had cost her everything. Jane gathered her single carpetbag, smoothed her faded blue traveling dress, and stepped onto the platform of a town she'd never heard of until today. Riverbank, Wyoming was little more than a cluster of wooden buildings strung along a dusty main street, with the Green River cutting a silver path behind it. "Miss, you look a mite lost." The station master, an elderly man with kind eyes, approached her. "Expecting someone to meet you?" Jane swallowed hard. "No, sir. I find myself unexpectedly stopping here." The man's weathered face creased with concern. "Not many single ladies just stop by Riverbank. You got people here?" "No, but I am sure I can find work. I can sew, cook, clean, and I've done bookkeeping." The station master scratched his chin. "Well, Mrs. Wilcox at the boarding house might take you in for a night. As for work..." His voice trailed off as he gazed down the street. "Tell you what, Thompson's General Store might need help. And the school's been looking for a teacher, though that won't start till fall." Jane thanked him and made her way down the dusty street, acutely aware of curious glances from the townspeople. The boarding house was a tidy two-story building with white curtains and a small sign. Mrs. Wilcox, a formidable widow with steel-gray hair, eyed Jane suspiciously. "I don't take in just anyone, miss. Especially not women traveling alone." "I understand," Jane replied, summoning her remaining dignity. "But I assure you, I'm respectable. I can pay for tonight, and I intend to find work immediately." After scrutinizing Jane's worn but well-mended clothes and proper speech, Mrs. Wilcox reluctantly showed her to a small room on the second floor. "Dinner's at 6 sharp. Don't be late." Alone in the sparse room, Jane finally allowed herself to cry. Everything she owned was in the carpetbag beside her: 3 dresses, undergarments, a hairbrush, her mother's Bible, and $8 that would soon be reduced to $7 after tonight's lodging. She had risked everything on this journey west. After her father's death had revealed his gambling debts, their Boston home had been seized. With no relatives and few prospects in a city where her father's disgrace followed her, Jane had answered Mr. Cunningham's advertisement for a bride. Their correspondence had seemed promising. He wanted an educated woman to help with his business affairs and provide companionship. She had been honest about everything except her financial situation, hoping that by the time he discovered the truth, he would already care for her enough that it wouldn't matter. She had been wrong. After washing her face and pinning her chestnut hair neatly, Jane ventured downstairs for dinner. The dining room held 3 other boarders: a traveling salesman, an elderly woman, and a young man who introduced himself as the town's telegraph operator. "New faces are always welcome in Riverbank," he said cheerfully, "though most folks just pass through." "I may be staying," Jane replied carefully. "I'm looking for work, actually." Mrs. Wilcox set down a platter of roast beef. Thompson turned away the last 3 girls who asked. "Says business is too slow for hiring." Jane's heart sank. "What about the school position?" "Board wants someone with experience," the telegraph operator said. "Last teacher left mid-term when she married a rancher from Montana." After dinner, Jane walked down the main street, noting the saloon, bank, livery stable, and the handful of shops now closed for the evening. Desperation began to creep in as she realized how few opportunities this small town offered. The following morning, Jane visited every business in Riverbank. By noon, she'd been rejected by all of them. Too many workers, not enough customers, no need for a woman's help. The excuses varied, but the result was the same. As the afternoon sun beat down, Jane found herself at the edge of town near a small creek. She removed her boots and dipped her aching feet in the cool water, fighting back tears. How had her life come to this? In 3 days, she would run out of money for the boarding house. Then what? The sound of approaching hoofbeats made her hastily withdraw her feet and smooth her skirts. A man on horseback appeared, leading a second horse laden with supplies. He reined in when he saw her. "Afternoon, madam," he called, tipping his hat to reveal sandy brown hair. His face was tanned from the sun, with lines at the corners of his eyes suggesting he smiled often. He looked to be in his early 30s, with broad shoulders and strong hands that spoke of hard work. "Good afternoon," Jane replied, embarrassed to be caught in such an informal position. The man dismounted with fluid grace. "Don't believe I've seen you in Riverbank before. I'm Matthew Hayes. Jane Calloway. I arrived yesterday. Visiting family." Jane hesitated, then decided honesty might serve her better than pride. "No, I was traveling to meet someone in prosperity, but plans changed. Now I'm looking for work." Matthew nodded thoughtfully, his blue eyes assessing her. "Found anything yet?" "No. It seems Riverbank doesn't need another pair of hands. Town might not, but I do." He gestured to the rolling hills beyond. "Got a farm about 3 miles out. 160 acres under the Homestead Act. Been working it 5 years now. Growing wheat mostly, some vegetables, got a few livestock." Jane waited, unsure where this conversation was heading. "My sister Beth's been helping with the house and such, but she's marrying next month. Moving to her husband's place in Laramie." Matthew shifted his weight. "I've been looking for someone to help cooking, cleaning, maybe keeping accounts. Could offer room and board, plus $10 a month." Jane stared at him, hope and wariness warring within her. "Mr. Hayes, are you offering me employment?" "Yes, madam. Nothing improper," he added quickly. "Got a small cabin Beth's been using. It's simple but private. You'd take meals at the main house." It was more than Jane had dared hope for, but caution made her hesitate. "You don't know anything about me." Matthew smiled, revealing a dimple in his right cheek. "I know you're educated by your speech. Your hands show you're no stranger to work, despite those city clothes. And Mrs. Wilcox wouldn't have let you stay if she thought you were trouble." He paused. "Truth is, I need help, and you need work. Seems Providence might have brought us together at the right time." Jane considered her options, which were essentially non-existent. "When would you need me to start?" "Could pick you up tomorrow morning if that suits. Give you time to see the place before deciding for certain." Jane nodded. "That would be acceptable. Thank you, Mr. Hayes." "Matthew," he corrected with another smile. "Out here, formality doesn't last long." He tipped his hat again, remounted his horse, and continued toward town. Jane watched him go, wondering if she was making another mistake or if, perhaps, her luck was finally changing. The following morning, Jane was ready when Matthew arrived with a wagon. Mrs. Wilcox watched from the porch, her expression suggesting she wasn't sure if she approved of this arrangement. "Mr. Hayes is respectable enough," the older woman had told Jane the night before. "Keeps to himself mostly, works hard. His sister's a good girl, teaches Sunday school when they make it to town." The journey to the Hayes farm took nearly an hour over rough roads. Jane tried to hide her nervousness as they left the town behind, the landscape opening into rolling hills dotted with sagebrush and occasional stands of cottonwoods near creeks. "Land's not as rich as back east," Matthew commented, seeming to read her thoughts. "But with irrigation from the creek, it produces well enough. This year's wheat looks promising." As they crested a hill, Jane saw the farm spread before them, acres of wheat rippling in the breeze, a vegetable garden, a modest orchard, and several outbuildings surrounding a 2-story farmhouse. It wasn't grand, but everything appeared well maintained. "It's lovely," Jane said honestly. Matthew's expression softened with pride. "Started with just a 1-room cabin. Built the house 2 years ago when things started turning a profit." Beth Hayes met them at the door, a pretty young woman with the same sandy hair as her brother, but green eyes instead of blue. Her welcome was genuine, if a bit reserved, until she and Jane began discussing household matters. By the time they'd toured the house and the small cabin where Jane would stay, Beth's initial caution had transformed into relief. I've been worried sick about leaving Matt all alone, she confided as they walked through the vegetable garden. He works from dawn till dusk, and then comes into cold meals because he won't take time to cook proper. Man would live on coffee and biscuits if left to himself. I'm an adequate cook, Jane assured her, though I'll need guidance on using a wood stove. In Boston, she stopped, realizing she was revealing more than intended. Beth's eyebrows rose. Boston? You've come a long way, Miss Calloway. Jane, please. And yes, I have. After the tour, Matthew showed Jane to the cabin while Beth prepared lunch. The small structure was simple but clean, with a narrow bed, a chest of drawers, a rocking chair by the window, and a small table with an oil lamp. It's not much, Matthew said, suddenly seeming self-conscious. But it's private. It's perfect, Jane replied, meaning it. After nearly becoming homeless, this small space felt like a sanctuary. Over lunch, they discussed duties and expectations. Jane would cook meals, clean the main house, tend the kitchen garden, help with preserving foods, and keep the farm's accounts. Matthew explained that most days, he worked the fields with 2 hired hands who lived in the bunkhouse near the barn. Sundays are for rest, he said firmly. We usually attend church in town when weather permits. By day's end, Jane had decided to accept the position. Matthew drove her back to the boarding house to collect her things, and by nightfall, she was settled in her new cabin, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the Wyoming night, the distant howl of coyotes, the whisper of wind through the wheat, the occasional lowing of cattle. Despite her exhaustion, sleep eluded her as she contemplated the strange turn her life had taken. 3 days ago, she had been en route to marry a stranger. Now she was employed by a different stranger, living on an isolated farm miles from town. Yet somehow, this felt more honest than the arrangement she'd made with Mr. Cunningham. Please, she whispered into the darkness, let this be the right choice. Jane quickly settled into the rhythm of farm life. She rose before dawn to start the fire in the cook stove and prepare breakfast for Matthew and the farmhands Pete Martinez, a Mexican-American man in his 40s who'd been with Matthew since the beginning, and young Jimmy Doyle, barely 18, and saving money to claim his own homestead someday. Beth proved to be an excellent teacher, showing Jane how to manage the temperamental stove, preserve vegetables from the garden, and adapt to the realities of frontier housekeeping. During her first week, Jane burned the biscuits twice, undercooked a stew, and nearly ruined a batch of peach preserves, but no one complained. By the second week, she was managing on her own as Beth focused on preparations for her upcoming wedding. The farm's account books fascinated Jane. Matthew had kept meticulous records of expenses and income, but his system was basic. With his permission, she reorganized everything, creating separate ledgers for different aspects of the farm operation and developing projections for the fall harvest. This is impressive, Matthew said one evening as they sat at the kitchen table reviewing her work. Where did you learn bookkeeping? Jane stiffened slightly. My father was in trade. He taught me. Matthew seemed to sense her reluctance to elaborate. Well, I'm grateful for the skill. I can track yields and costs, but this level of organization was beyond me. As July turned to August, Beth departed for a 2-week visit with her fiancé's family in Laramie, leaving Jane in full charge of the household. The responsibility was daunting but also invigorating. For the first time since her father's death, Jane felt truly useful. She began adding small touches to make the house more welcoming: wildflowers on the table, curtains washed and pressed to brightness, special care taken with meals. Matthew noticed, offering quiet thanks that meant more to Jane than effusive praise would have. One evening, as Jane kneaded bread dough while Matthew repaired a harness at the kitchen table, he asked, "Why were you headed to prosperity?" Jane's hands stilled momentarily before resuming their rhythm. "I was to be married." Matthew looked up, surprise evident on his face. "What happened?" He changed his mind. Jane focused on the dough, pushing perhaps harder than necessary. "When he learned I had no dowry." "You were a mail-order bride?" There was no judgment in his voice, only curiosity. "Yes. After my father died, I had few options in Boston." The words came more easily than she'd expected. Mr. Cunningham advertised for an educated lady of good character to share his home and assist in his mercantile business. We corresponded for 3 months before he sent train fare. "But he rejected you before you arrived?" Jane nodded, embarrassment heating her cheeks. I may have implied I had modest savings. When he inquired more specifically and learned the truth, he telegraphed that our arrangement was terminated. She glanced up. I didn't lie about anything else: my character, my skills, my willingness to work hard. Just my financial situation. Matthew set down the harness. He was a fool. The simple statement, delivered with such conviction, brought unexpected tears to Jane's eyes. She turned away quickly, busying herself with shaping the bread loaves. I've seen men out here marry for all sorts of reasons, Matthew continued. Money, land, livestock. Most of those marriages fall apart. The ones that last are built on respect and partnership. He picked up the harness again. Anyone who can reorganize my chaotic accounts, make this house feel like a home, and master that temperamental stove in 2 weeks is worth far more than whatever dowry he was expecting. Jane didn't trust herself to speak, but warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the August heat or the nearby stove. As Beth's wedding approached, Jane accompanied Matthew to town for supplies and to have a new dress made for the occasion. Riverbank looked different to her now, less intimidating, more familiar. Mrs. Wilcox greeted her warmly, clearly relieved that Jane had found respectable employment. The shopkeepers who had turned her away now welcomed her as Matthew Hayes's housekeeper. Blue would suit you, the dressmaker said, holding fabric against Jane's skin. Brings out the gold in your eyes. Perhaps something more practical, Jane suggested, mindful of her position. Nonsense, Matthew interrupted from where he'd been examining hats. It's a celebration. Get the blue. Jane started to protest, but something in his expression made her reconsider. The blue, then, she agreed, and was rewarded with a smile that made her heart skip inexplicably. On the wagon ride home, they encountered dark clouds building on the horizon. Matthew urged the horses to a faster pace, his expression concerned. Summer storms can turn dangerous quickly, he explained. Flash floods in the creeks, lightning strikes. They were still a mile from the farm when the storm broke. Rain lashed down in sheets, turning the dirt road to mud within minutes. Lightning cracked overhead, followed immediately by booming thunder. The horses grew skittish, requiring all of Matthew's skill to control. We'll never make it to the house, he shouted over the deluge. There's a line shack just ahead, shelter for the winter cattle drive. We'll wait it out there. The small cabin appeared through the curtain of rain, little more than 4 walls and a roof, but a welcome sight nonetheless. Matthew helped Jane down from the wagon, then quickly led the horses to a lean-to attached to the shack's side. Inside, the cabin was dusty but dry. A small stone fireplace, a rough wooden table with 2 chairs, a narrow cot, and shelves holding basic supplies were the only furnishings. Jane stood dripping on the dirt floor, suddenly aware of how improper their situation would appear to others. Matthew seemed to have the same thought as he returned from securing the horses. I'm sorry for the circumstances, he said stiffly. I should have checked the weather more carefully before we left town. You couldn't have predicted this, Jane assured him, wringing water from her skirts. She shivered involuntarily. Matthew immediately began gathering wood from a stack beside the fireplace. You need to get warm. There might be some dry clothes in that trunk, emergency supplies for the cattle drives. Jane found a rough woolen shirt and trousers that would swim on her smaller frame, but were blessedly dry. Matthew politely turned his back while she changed behind the privacy of a blanket strung across one corner. She emerged feeling ridiculous in the oversized clothes, but considerably warmer, especially after Matthew got a fire blazing. Your turn, she said, taking her place by the fire while he found dry clothes for himself. The storm showed no signs of abating. Rain drummed on the roof, occasionally punctuated by thunder that shook the small cabin. Matthew found coffee and a few other supplies on the shelves, and soon they were sitting at the rough table with steaming cups, their wet clothes drying by the fire. Beth will worry, Jane said, watching rainwater form puddles beneath the single window. Pete and Jimmy will tell her we must have stayed in town because of the storm, Matthew replied. They know I wouldn't risk crossing the creeks when they're running high. A comfortable silence fell between them. Jane studied Matthew's profile in the firelight, the strong line of his jaw, the slight crook in his nose that suggested it had once been broken, the way his hair curled slightly when damp. She had grown accustomed to his presence over the past month. But something about this forced intimacy made her newly aware of him as a man rather than simply her employer. "How did you end up in Wyoming?" she asked, breaking the silence. Matthew's expression softened with memory. "After the war, I served with the Union. There wasn't much left for me in Pennsylvania. Parents died while I was away, farm was neglected. Sold it, and headed west with Beth. She was just 16 then." He sipped his coffee. "Worked on other men's ranches for 3 years, saving every penny. Then claimed this land under the Homestead Act. It couldn't have been easy, starting from nothing. First 2 years were the hardest. Lived in a sod house while building the cabin. Lost half my first wheat crop to drought, second to grasshoppers." He smiled ruefully. "Considered giving up more than once, but Beth wouldn't hear of it. Said we hadn't come all this way to fail. She's remarkable," Jane said sincerely, having grown fond of the younger woman's determination and cheerful spirit. "She is. Gave up a lot to follow her older brother on this fool's errand." He looked directly at Jane. "That's why her marrying Tom is both wonderful and difficult. She deserves happiness, but the farm won't be the same without her." "No, it won't," Jane agreed softly. "But she's leaving it in good hands." Something changed in Matthew's expression, a warmth that made Jane's pulse quicken. "I hope those hands include yours, Jane. I don't just mean for a few months." Before she could respond, a particularly violent thunderclap shook the cabin, followed by the sound of frightened horses. Matthew jumped up. "Need to check on them." Left alone, Jane tried to make sense of what had just happened, what he had implied. Was he suggesting she stay on permanently as his housekeeper? Or was there more behind his words? By the time Matthew returned, soaked again despite his brief absence, Jane had composed herself. They spoke of practical matters, whether the creek would be passable by morning, if the wheat fields had suffered damage, how Beth's wedding preparations were progressing. Neither mentioned their interrupted conversation. As night fell, the storm finally began to ease. Matthew insisted Jane take the cot, while he would sleep on a bedroll by the fire. Despite her exhaustion, Jane lay awake listening to the rain's gentle aftermath and Matthew's steady breathing across the small space. She had come west to be a wife, to build a new life far from the shame and poverty that had followed her father's death. Instead, she had found something unexpected: independence, respect, and perhaps the beginnings of something more precious than the security she had sought. Dawn broke, clear and golden, the storm's only remnants being puddles and mud. Matthew determined that the creeks, while swollen, were passable. They donned their now dry clothes and headed back to the farm, where Beth greeted them with relief and knowing glances that made Jane blush despite the complete propriety of their forced shelter. The following weeks passed in a flurry of wedding preparations. Beth and Tom White would marry in Riverbank's small church, with a celebration afterward at the farm. Jane threw herself into the arrangements, baking, cleaning, helping Beth finish her wedding dress, and preparing the house to host 20 guests. The day before the wedding, unexpected visitors arrived: Mr. Cunningham and his sister from Prosperity. Beth had innocently invited them, unaware of Jane's history with the man. She had only mentioned that Jane had once corresponded with a storekeeper from the neighboring town. Jane was hanging fresh curtains when the wagon pulled up. She recognized Albert Cunningham immediately, a thin man in his 40s with a fastidious mustache and calculating eyes. The woman beside him, presumably his sister, wore an expression of perpetual disapproval. Matthew greeted them in the yard while Jane remained frozen by the window, mortification washing over her. She had no choice but to face them when Beth called her to help with refreshments. Mr. Cunningham's eyes widened in recognition when Jane entered the kitchen. "Miss Calloway, what an unexpected surprise." "Mr. Cunningham," Jane replied stiffly, setting down a tray with coffee cups. Beth looked between them, confusion evident. "You two have met." "Miss Calloway and I had an arrangement that unfortunately could not be fulfilled," Mr. Cunningham said smoothly. "I didn't realize she had found a position so close by." His emphasis on the last words carried clear insinuation. Jane's cheeks burned, but before she could respond, Matthew spoke. "Jane has been invaluable to us," he said, his voice steady but with an underlying edge. "We consider ourselves fortunate that circumstances brought her here instead of Prosperity." Mr. Cunningham's sister sniffed audibly. "Well, I suppose things work out for the best." Albert discovered she had misrepresented her financial situation. One wonders what else might have been concealed. The room fell silent. Jane stared at her hands, shame threatening to overwhelm her. Jane has never misrepresented her character or her abilities, Matthew said quietly. Those are what matter to me. Jane glanced up, meeting his gaze. The steadiness there gave her strength. I apologized for that deception in my final letter, Mr. Cunningham, she said. It was wrong of me. Born of desperation after my father's death left me destitute. But as Mr. Hayes says, my character and abilities are honest. Indeed, Mr. Cunningham replied stiffly. Well, what's done is done. I've since become engaged to Miss Eleanor Potter of Denver. Her father owns 3 silver mines. The implied comparison was clear, but Jane found she no longer cared about this man's opinion. Congratulations. I wish you both happiness. The conversation moved to other topics, but an undercurrent of tension remained. When the Cunninghams finally departed, promising to return for tomorrow's wedding, Jane escaped to her cabin, desperate for solitude. She wasn't surprised when Matthew knocked on her door an hour later. She invited him in, managing a small smile. I should have told you they might be coming. Beth didn't know the full story, Matthew said, remaining by the door. She just remembered you mentioning correspondence with a merchant in Prosperity. It's humiliating, Jane admitted, to be reminded of my deception and rejection. The only person who should be embarrassed is Cunningham, Matthew replied firmly. Any man who values money over character isn't worth your regret. His certainty was balm to Jane's wounded pride. Thank you for defending me. Matthew stepped closer. Jane, he stopped, seemed to reconsider. We should focus on Beth's wedding. But afterward, I'd like us to talk about the future. Before she could ask what he meant, he bid her good night and departed, leaving Jane with more questions than answers. Beth's wedding day dawned clear and perfect. The small church in Riverbank overflowed with guests as Beth, radiant in her ivory dress, married Tom White. Jane sat beside Matthew in the front pew, acutely aware of his presence and the Cunninghams' watchful eyes from across the aisle. The celebration at the farm afterward was joyous tables set up under the cottonwoods, food abundant, and fiddle music inspiring dancing long into the evening. Jane kept busy serving guests, refilling plates, and ensuring everything ran smoothly. As sunset painted the sky in brilliant orange and pink, she finally paused by the creek, away from the celebration, to catch her breath. The sound of footsteps made her turn to find Matthew approaching. You've worked too hard today, he said, offering her a cup of punch. You should be celebrating too. I'm happy for Beth, Jane replied, accepting the drink. She and Tom are well matched. They are. Matthew gazed toward the party, where his sister was laughing in her new husband's arms. Makes a man think about his own future. Jane's heart quickened. Does it, Jane? Matthew began, turning to face her fully. I've been wanting to say there you are, Hayes. Albert Cunningham's voice interrupted as he approached from the party. Quite the celebration. Your sister makes a lovely bride. Matthew's expression closed slightly. Thank you, Cunningham. Is there something you needed? Just conversation, the merchant replied, though his eyes darted calculatingly between Matthew and Jane. I was telling my sister what fine property you have here. Must be worth a considerable sum now, with the improvements and increased settlement in the territory. It's not for sale, if that's your interest, Matthew replied coolly. Of course not. Just making an observation. Cunningham smiled thinly. Miss Calloway seems to have landed on her feet quite well. From mail order bride to housekeeper. Though one wonders if that's the full extent of the arrangement. Jane gasped at the implication. Matthew stepped forward, his posture stiffening. Mr. Cunningham, you're a guest at my sister's wedding, so I'll ask politely that you apologize to Miss Calloway and refrain from further insults. Insults? I merely observe that an unmarried woman living on a remote farm with an unmarried man invites certain assumptions. Matthew's hands clenched. Jane's reputation is beyond reproach. If anyone suggests otherwise, they'll answer to me. Cunningham backed up slightly, apparently recognizing he'd pushed too far. No offense intended, of course. Just concern for the young ladies standing in the community. Your concern is noted and unnecessary, Matthew replied tersely. Now, if you'll excuse us. With a stiff nod, Cunningham retreated toward the celebration. Jane exhaled shakily. I'm sorry. I've brought this complication to your door. You have nothing to apologize for, Matthew said firmly. Cunningham is a small man trying to make himself feel important by belittling others. They stood in awkward silence for a moment before Matthew continued. This isn't how I planned this conversation, but perhaps it's necessary now. He took a deep breath. Jane, I've grown to admire you tremendously these past weeks. Your intelligence, your determination, your kindness to Beth, your willingness to adapt to this hard life. Jane's pulse raced as she tried to interpret his meaning. I know you came west seeking marriage, security. Then you accepted a position as my housekeeper out of necessity. Matthew's voice grew more hesitant. But I find myself hoping you might consider a different arrangement. What arrangement? Jane barely trusted herself to speak. Marriage, Matthew said simply. Not as a matter of convenience or necessity, but because I believe we could build something good together. I'm not a wealthy man like Cunningham claims to be, but the farm prospers, and I can offer you a true partnership. Jane stared at him, momentarily speechless. Matthew, are you proposing? Badly, it seems, he replied with a self-conscious laugh. I had planned to wait until after Beth's departure, to speak more eloquently. But seeing you with Cunningham, hearing his insinuations, he shook his head. I couldn't wait. You want to marry me? Truly. Yes, Jane. I believe I started falling in love with you that day by the creek when we first met. Your courage, your honesty about your situation, it impressed me then, and everything since has only deepened my admiration. He took her hands. I understand if you need time to consider, or if your feelings don't match mine. Your position here is secure regardless. Jane looked into his earnest blue eyes and recognized the truth she'd been avoiding acknowledging to herself. I don't need time, she said softly. I've spent my life making practical decisions, seeking security above all else. Even my arrangement with Mr. Cunningham was based on practicality rather than affection. Matthew's expression fell slightly, but Jane continued. But my feelings for you aren't practical at all. They're unexpected and overwhelming and wonderful. She squeezed his hands. Yes, Matthew, I would be honored to marry you. The joy that transformed his face was answer enough. But then he gathered her into his arms and kissed her with a tenderness that made her heart soar. When they finally parted, both breathing quickly, the sounds of the celebration seemed distant and unimportant. We should return to the party, Jane said reluctantly. It's Beth's day, not ours. Matthew nodded, but kept hold of her hand. We'll tell her tomorrow, before she and Tom leave. They rejoined the celebration, and if guests noticed their linked hands or the newfound brightness in their expressions, no one commented except Beth, who caught Jane's eye across the dance floor and smiled knowingly. The following morning, as Beth and Tom prepared to depart for their new home in Laramie, Matthew and Jane shared their news. Beth's delighted squeal brought Tom running from the barn. I knew it, she exclaimed, hugging them both. I've been hoping for this since I saw how you looked at each other after that storm. You're not upset? It's so soon after your wedding, Jane worried. Upset? I'm thrilled. Knowing Matt won't be alone makes leaving so much easier. Beth's eyes glistened with happy tears. When will you marry? We thought perhaps next month, Matthew replied. Time for proper announcements, but no reason to wait through winter. As Beth and Tom's wagon disappeared down the road, Matthew turned to Jane. Are you certain about this? It's not too rushed. Jane shook her head. I came west seeking a new beginning. I thought it would be in prosperity with a man I'd never met. Instead, I found it here, with you. She smiled up at him. This feels right in a way nothing else ever has. September passed in a blur of harvest work and wedding preparations. Word spread quickly through Riverbank, and Jane was touched by the community's positive response. Mrs. Wilcox insisted on hosting a small gathering for the women of the town to welcome Jane properly. Even Mr. Thompson, who had rejected her job application, offered congratulations and a wedding gift. Only one shadow fell across their happiness. A letter arrived from Mr. Cunningham, ostensibly congratulating them, but containing a thinly veiled suggestion that Matthew was being deceived by a woman with a history of dishonesty. Matthew threw it into the fire without comment, but Jane saw the momentary doubt in his eyes. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Jane gathered her courage. I need to tell you everything about my past, she said quietly. So there are no secrets between us. Matthew started to protest, but Jane pressed on. Please, I need you to know the whole truth. She told him about her comfortable childhood in Boston, her father's position as a respected merchant, and the education she'd received. Then came the darker chapter: her father's growing gambling problem after her mother's death, the mounting debts he'd hidden, and his eventual suicide when creditors threatened exposure. I discovered after his death that everything was gone: our home, his business, even my mother's jewelry. Worse, his reputation was destroyed. No respectable family in Boston would receive me. Jane's voice broke slightly. I had no skills for meaningful employment, no relatives to take me in. The only position I could find was as a shop girl, working 16 hours a day for barely enough to afford a tiny room in a boarding house of questionable reputation. Matthew listened without interruption, his face compassionate. When I saw Mr. Cunningham's advertisement, it seemed providential. I was honest about everything except my financial situation. I implied I had modest savings when in reality, I had scraped together just enough for a few new clothes befitting a merchant's wife. Jane met Matthew's gaze directly. That was my only deception, but it was enough. When he learned the truth, he ended our arrangement immediately. Thank God he did, Matthew said softly, or you never would have stopped in Riverbank. Jane blinked in surprise. You're not disappointed by my history? My father's disgrace? Jane, we all have pasts. I have my own regrets from the war, decisions I wish I could change. He took her hand. What matters is who we are now, and who we choose to be tomorrow. Relief washed over Jane. I've been so afraid that once you knew everything, you might reconsider. Never, Matthew said firmly. If anything, knowing what you've overcome only increases my admiration. He kissed her hand. No more secrets between us, and no more worries about Cunningham or anyone else's opinions. Their wedding took place on the first Saturday in October, with the aspen trees turning gold against the blue Wyoming sky. The small church in Riverbank was filled with townspeople and neighboring farmers. Pete served as Matthew's best man, while Beth, who had returned for the occasion, stood with Jane. As Jane walked down the aisle in her blue dress, the one Matthew had insisted she purchase months earlier, she marveled at the journey that had brought her here. The rejection that had seemed so devastating in June had led to this moment of perfect happiness. Reverend Collins smiled benevolently as he began the ceremony. Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today to join Matthew James Hayes and Jane Elizabeth Calloway in holy matrimony. Jane heard the words as if from a distance, overwhelmed by the love shining in Matthew's eyes as he took her hands in his. When they exchanged vows, her voice was steady and sure. All doubts vanished. This wasn't the practical arrangement she had sought with Mr. Cunningham. This was a union of hearts. I now pronounce you husband and wife, Reverend Collins declared. What God has joined together, let no man put asunder. Matthew's kiss was both tender and promising, bringing applause and a few good-natured cheers from the congregation. As they turned to face their friends and neighbors as Mr. and Mrs. Hayes, Jane felt a completeness she had never expected to find. The celebration at the farm afterward was joyous, not as large as Beth's wedding, but filled with genuine warmth. Jane danced with her new husband beneath lanterns strung from the cottonwoods, savoring the knowledge that this was now truly her home. As evening fell, the guests gradually departed until only family remained: Beth and Tom, Pete and Jimmy, and a few of Matthew's cousins who had traveled from Colorado for the wedding. They sat around the fire pit, sharing stories and laughter under the vast canopy of stars. To think, Beth said, leaning against Tom's shoulder, if Jane had made it to prosperity as planned, none of this would have happened. I prefer to think it was meant to be, Matthew replied, his arm around Jane's waist. Some things are just written in the stars. Later, alone in the farmhouse that was now truly their home, Matthew and Jane faced the sweet awkwardness of new marriage. Their first night together was a discovery of tenderness and passion that exceeded Jane's expectations, confirming that their bond went far beyond practical considerations. As they lay entwined in the darkness, Jane whispered, I never thought I could be this happy. Matthew kissed her forehead. This is just the beginning, Mrs. Hayes. The seasons turned, and Jane embraced her role as a farmer's wife with the same determination she had shown as his housekeeper. The work was hard, especially when winter arrived with biting winds and deep snow, but she found profound satisfaction in building a life alongside Matthew. By spring, Jane had news to share. As they planted the kitchen garden on a mild April day, she placed Matthew's hand on her still flat stomach. "We'll need to expand this garden," she said softly. "We'll have another mouth to feed by harvest time." Matthew's expression transformed from confusion to wonder to joy in the space of a heartbeat. He pulled her into his arms, laughing and crying at once. "A baby? You're certain?" "As certain as one can be," Jane replied, her own eyes damp. "Mrs. Wilcox confirmed my suspicions when we were in town yesterday." That night, they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Matthew's hand protectively covering Jane's abdomen. "Boy or girl, doesn't matter to me," he said. "Just healthy and happy." "And loved," Jane added. "So very loved." As the Wyoming twilight deepened around them, Jane reflected on the strange, wonderful journey that had brought her here. The pain of rejection had opened the door to genuine love. The desperate young woman who had boarded a train in Boston with false hopes and $8 to her name had found something far more precious than the security she'd sought. She had found home. Their daughter, Elizabeth Rose Hayes, was born on a crisp November morning in 1876, with Beth returning to assist with the birth. The baby had Matthew's blue eyes and Jane's chestnut hair, and from her first lusty cry, she was the center of their world. As Jane cradled her newborn daughter, while Matthew looked on with undisguised adoration, she remembered something her mother had once told her. "Sometimes, Jane, the greatest blessings come disguised as disappointments." How right she had been. The telegram that had left Jane stranded and heartbroken in Riverbank had actually been delivering her to exactly where she was meant to be in this house, with this man, holding this child, surrounded by love that no amount of money could ever purchase. "Welcome to the world, little one," Jane whispered to her daughter. "You are the most beautiful chapter in our unexpected story." Matthew leaned down to kiss them both, his farmer's hands gentle as they touched his daughter's tiny fingers. "And the story," he promised, "is just beginning."